This is Unfragmented, inspired by Colossians. For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. Join our book club as we pursue a more consistent Christian life.
All right, welcome to Unfragmented, where Lee Bortons and I explore the cohesion of things believed with things done. Today is Thursday, April 13th, 2023. I'm Kevin Novak. Lee Bortons is our co-host. And this month we're talking about economics in one lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And we'll be talking about this book for the rest of April, Economics in One Lesson. And it's a great book so far. We're going to be talking about this for the next 3 weeks.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so we've been kind of finding our footing and starting these podcasts, and we've had a lot of guests on. But what I really wanted it to be was more of a just show up, where we would read passages together and discuss those passages. These are particularly difficult books, and just being super general about it, I don't think it's been very successful. A lot of people, this is the first time they've heard these ideas. And so I wanted to try this format with the Henry Hazlitt book. He's dead. We can't have him on as an author, but Kevin has been looking into having some folks that are really up on his ideas come on to be a guest at least one time this month. And if that doesn't happen, that's okay, because I love that Nicole's here. All right, so it's always going to be a good conversation. So with that said, Julie, can you put up the PDF, and then she's going to put it in the chat? So like if you want to pull it up yourself, Nicole or Kevin, you'd have it
quick, and then share it again.
So I own this book and I could not find it anywhere. So I've been reading it off the PDF and listening to the audio. And
we're going to lesson 1, right?
Yeah, just
the
go
lesson.
There we go. Okay. So what I thought I would do is just read for 5 minutes, and then write questions in the chat box or on your piece of paper. And then we would stop, and we actually would be quiet for a minute to let people gather their thoughts and really enjoy this book and its words together. And then after you've gathered your thoughts, we can either talk about it, or someone else can read like another 5 minutes until we get through chapter 1. And then we would have a longer conversation. So let's give that a shot and see how it works. You ready? You're going to have to scroll for me, Julie. Okay. Economics is haunted by more fallacies than any other study known to man. This is no accident. The inherent difficulties of this subject would be great enough in any case, but they are multiplied 1,000-fold by a factor that is insignificant in, say, physics or mathematics or medicine, the special pleading of self-interest. While every group has certain economic interests identical with those of all groups, every group has also, as we shall see, interests antagonistic to those of other groups. While certain public policies would in the long run benefit everybody, other policies would benefit one group only at the expense of all other groups. The group that would benefit by such policies, having such a direct interest in them, will argue for them plausibly and persistently. It will hire the best viable minds to devote their whole time to presenting its case, and it will finally either convince the general public that its case is sound, or so befuddle it that clear thinking on the subject becomes next to impossible. In addition to those endless pleadings of self-interest, there's a second main factor that spawns new economic fallacies every day. This is the persistent tendency of men to see only the immediate effects of a given policy, or its effects only on a special group, and to neglect to inquire what the long-run effects of that policy will be, not only on the special group, but on all groups. It's the fallacy of overlooking secondary consequences. In this lies almost the whole difference between good economists and bad. The bad economist sees only what immediately strikes the eye. The good economist also looks beyond. The bad economist sees only the direct consequences of a proposed course. The good economist looks also at the longer and indirect consequences. The bad economist sees only what the effect of a given policy has been or will be on one particular group. The good economist inquires also what the effect of the policy will be on all groups. The distinction may seem obvious. The precaution of looking for all the consequences of a given policy to everyone may seem elementary. Doesn't everybody know in his personal life that there are all sorts of indulgences delightful at the moment, but disastrous in the end? Doesn't every little boy know that if he eats enough candy, he'll get sick? Doesn't the fellow who gets drunk know that he will wake up next morning with a ghastly stomach ache and a horrible head? Doesn't the dipsomaniac know he's ruining his liver and shortening his life? Doesn't the Don Juan know that he's letting himself in for every sort of risk, from blackmail to disease? Finally, to bring it to the economic, though still personal realm, do not the idler and the spendthrift know, even in the midst of their glorious fling, that they're heading for a future of debt and poverty? So I'll stop there and take 60 seconds to think. And then, I don't know, Kevin, can you read next?
Sure.
Okay, give us some time.
Hey, you guys, I just came in late. Where are you at in the book?
I'm reading off the PDF if you can't see it. It should be your second page of chapter 1.
Okay. All right, thanks. Because it's so small and I'm slight challenged.
Sure.
In the chat, if you want to open your own version, that is
okay.
fine. But I can also make this bigger.
That's how silly I am. I'm looking at your screen, and the number of times I've been doing Zooms, I'm pressing on the plus, trying to get it to enlarge. And then I went, oh, wait a minute, that's not my screen. There, that's great. Thank you. If you guys don't mind.
No, you're welcome.
You go ahead and chat your questions or your ideas so that they're safe for after Kevin's done. Okay, so before you read, Kevin, let's look at what Julie here had to say. I think it was you. The biblical consequent principles in the opening paragraphs. What are they? Like, give us an example.
The first one, the idle hand. So, the Bible talks a lot about being idle and, reaping and sowing. It's this work before the harvest. So idleness is not indicated to be a very good thing. And in this, does not the idler know, or the overspender. So if you think of being a good steward, stewardship is a lot in the Bible, or the theme of stewardship and generosity. So that was just kind of towards the end there. That jumped out at me. And it's interesting because a lot of the good practices that we do have, while not out and out, John 3:16, truth is truth, and principles that are laid out in Scripture can be applied to any good business person's, if you do things the way you ought to do things as laid out in scripture for us. But, if a person doesn't ever read the Bible and is still practicing some of these good habits because they actually see a harvest from what they're doing, typically they're probably following some of the principles laid out in scripture.
All right, Kevin, keep reading.
Yet when we enter the field of public economics, these elementary truths are ignored. There are men regarded today as brilliant economists who deprecate saving and recommend squandering on a national scale as the way of economic salvation. And when anyone points to what the consequences of these policies will be in the long run, they reply flippantly, as might the prodigal son of a warning father, "In the long run, we are all dead." And such shallow wisecracks pass as devastating epigrams and the ripest wisdom. But the tragedy is that, on the contrary, we are already suffering the long-run consequences of the policies of the remote or recent past. Today is already the tomorrow which the bad economists yesterday urged us to ignore. The long-run consequences of some economic policies may become evident in a few months. Others may not become evident for several years. Still others may not become evident for decades. But in every case, those long-run consequences are contained in the policy as surely as the hen was in the egg, the flower in the seed. From this aspect, therefore, the whole of economics can be reduced to a single lesson, and that lesson can be reduced to a single sentence. The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups.
Julie, can you copy that
Right.
italics part and put it in the chat? That way, because I think we should keep that in front of us. So, what is Henry Hazlitt's thesis? It's right here. Do you want to read it again, Kevin?
The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups.
So why don't we think for a minute, and then do you have like a burning question or a quote that you liked or something you didn't understand? And we'll put it in the chat and we'll actually have a discussion. Michelle, feel free to do it auditorily in a minute.
I'm back home. That's why I was late,
Okay.
because I was getting on my computer. I did have a question, but farther down or farther along in the book. So when we get to that, I've got it marked. I do have just sort of like a comment. When he said the persistent, it's in the second paragraph of the beginning of chapter 1, the persistent tendency of men to see only the immediate effects of a given policy or its effects only on a special group, and to neglect to inquire what the long run effects of that policy will not only be on that special group, but on all groups. I guess my editorial would be, as long as we have special interest groups that are running this train instead of our elected leaders, I honestly don't see how we can get past that.
Right. So just make sure I understand your pronouns. So you're talking about like maybe bureaucrats rather than the elected officials?
Yes. Yeah. Well, the special interest groups, they put a financial bounty on the heads of our elected officials, through their elections and donations and all of those types of things. And I think, just in my humble opinion, that's what is motivating. I don't know if motivating is the right word. It's those special interest groups that are directly involved in policy, whereas the elected officials are not able to look at long run effects of things that have happened in the past, because they're beholden to the money and to the groups.
Well, when I look at that part, because that's actually, Michelle, the part that you quoted is actually the lesson. When I look at that,
The lesson.
I think, I think there are two, I put in the chat box, it seems to me that there are two actual assertions here. When I think of the first assertion about being short-term rather than long-term, I think of spending immediately. I don't know if that's what everyone else thinks, but that's the big issue, the big example that I could come up with there. And then the other part being special interest. Now, I probably take what I would I probably take a minority opinion on like lobbying or special interests. And I have already read Freedomnomics, which we're going to talk about later in the year, and John R. Lott Jr. talks about this a lot. And certainly, Michelle, I understand what you're saying about special interests, and I do have I'm not saying you're cynical about it, but I do have a quasi-cynical view of special interests. But part of special interests are people like us that can actually participate in influencing legislators, and we could do that through like lobbyists and so on. I don't care for bureaucrats, which I wouldn't consider special interests, but I don't care for bureaucrats, definitely. But the other thing is, in terms of legislators taking money from lobbyists, it could be argued that they only take money from those groups with which they already agree. I think the root of it is the spending. That's the problem. And I think that with the spending, you definitely do not have a distinction between like conservative and liberal. And we're definitely, because legislators are, especially the representatives, are only, on 2-year terms, they're looking at the short term. They just want to be reelected. So they're looking at spending. And I think that to me is the bigger issue in terms of not looking at the long-term consequences, obviously inflation being a long-term consequence.
So can you tell me of a bureaucrat that's not associated with the special interest group? I want to just get you to define your terms.
Well, when I think of a bureaucrat, I think of someone that's like in the administration, could be appointed, someone that's looking out for their position. When I think of a special interest, I'm thinking of, like as an example, a lobbyist or someone like who's acting on behalf of a sector. So maybe we're thinking that they're the same thing, but a special interest to me would be someone trying to influence someone like a legislator, but not necessarily a bureaucrat.
Well, I guess the point I guess I would make the point that there would be no bureaucrats if there weren't special interests. The bureaucrats are there to administrate the policies that help the special interests. So I was trying to think, is there an example where what I just said is wrong? So even if it's a legitimate constitutional, biblical part of government, you have sinners running it, and they're going to always be looking out for their job and the interest of people who are talking to them. So I don't know how you separate the two.
Well, to me, a special interest would be someone trying to influence a legislator, and a legislator could be a legitimate, like, civil magistrate. I'm thinking of a bureaucrat as someone who is part of the, like, say, an agency. Not necessarily. Now, I don't think those people. I don't think that is a legitimate constitution or biblical position. But when I think of spending, I think of the legislator, not the bureaucrat.
But the legislator makes policies and gets out of office either because he quits or somebody else wins, and the bureaucrats left spending the money that they legislated. See, I feel like
Right,
the
but
whole
I
thing works
blame-
together.
I
So
agree, but I would blame the legislator for that, not the bureaucrat who's getting the money from the legislator. That would be a distinction I would draw. I would be mad at the legislator, not the bureaucrat.
So a bureaucrat is an unelected person, whereas a legislator would be an elected official. And,
Right, I would agree. I would agree with that.
okay. But yeah, I think I'm in the same column with Lee. I think they're just so intertwined with each other. How do you distinguish between the two?
Yep. I mean, the
Well,
legislator is obviously a different person, but the result of the legislation is the bureaucrat itself.
Well, the bureaucrat wouldn't necessarily have spending authority. That would originate, I guess, on the federal level with the House. And then
So
the
maybe
Senate would
I
need
don't
to
understand
also vote on it.
something, but I know that like when Rod Helder, who runs North Carolina's homeschool Department of Non-Public Education for our state, he actually asks for money, and the budget is based around the asks. It's not just based around, I'm the legislator and I think we should only spend $2 a year instead of $1 a year. So the legislator doesn't know what to spend money on because they're there for such a short time.
Well, I'm directing my ire at the legislator because they can always say no. I mean, they can always say no to spending bills. They're not going to, because again, they're looking at the short term. You know, the legislator could also get rid of the bureaucrat, but they don't.
That's true.
So, but there definitely is a relationship on the federal level that's called the Iron Triangle, where you have the bureaucrats, you have the lobbyists, the private sector, the legislators, where they all work together, and that's causing a gridlock, at least in terms of breaking the cycle of all the spending and the bureaucracy. So there's definitely a relationship there. I just direct, like I said, my ire towards the legislator. The bureaucrats make regulation, they make laws, and they can make law without the legislator now. So if we're talking about creating law, then I would direct my ire also towards the bureaucrat, but not necessarily for the spending. That would be the legislator that I would blame.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, the whole point of Hazlitt is money's, a lot of things that relate to money is hidden. And so you brought up a good point when you were defining your terms, and I'm saying, okay, most people are mad either at the legislator, or they're mad at spending, or they're mad that they're not getting enough. They don't really understand who makes the decisions on what money's being spent. They don't know about the OMB. They don't know about the bureaucrats administrating it. They don't know about the enforcement behind it. There's so many things that make it hard to figure out what's going on.
Well, one of the strategies, I would argue that the legislator, whether it's state or federal or even local, they actually want the bureaucrat, and that's because they can blame the bureaucrat when things go wrong. They're not going to blame the legislator. So that's why I'm distinguishing between a bureaucrat and a legislator. And even so-called conservative legislators are happy that the bureaucrat exists, because they can call them they can subpoena them and yell at them, and then the next day they go out to lunch together and they have, it's water under the bridge. So there's no consequence for the bureaucrat, but the bureaucrat gets blamed publicly.
So what would you call the new classical conversation, freedom ship 5014C? where I'm paying out of my pocket for 8 lobbyists to go to the legislators and say, please do not give us any money. Are we a special interest because we're telling them not to give us money?
Well, in that regard, I that's what I was saying earlier, is that I'm okay with that because, number one, you're trying to influence, you're trying to get them to implement biblical principles. I'm okay with that. And what I was saying is I'm not per se against lobbying. I'm not per se against it, because some of it can be good and some of it can allow people like us that don't have $1 million to, if we were
Have
a
a voice.
corporation.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's why I'm saying I'm not gonna say per se I'm against lobbying. Now, if we're talking like a carve out, like special interest, like Wall Street, to me that's bad. So, but I would just have to distinguish between, and you know, George Gilder in his book towards the end, when he let loose a little bit, he railed against special interest and lobbying, and I think there should have been some extrapolation there, a little more breakdown. And again, like I said, you're probably not going to convince a liberal Democrat to side with you, but what you can at least do are go to those people that are already in your camp and shore them up and at least try to convince them or move the needle a little bit.
Actually, aren't
And I
those
think
the ones that are siding with us, Lee? On this
Yeah, right now they
particular
are.
issue? They don't want the money either. They want the
Yeah.
unions to run it.
Well,
that's-
they want the
that's a
money for what they
different
want it
example.
for.
Right.
Okay, Kevin.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
So
well,
I didn't
in
mean
this
to get off on the
situation, that's
special. Okay.
probably not the best example here, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, because the reason I was trying to think about the bureaucrat is because I actually enforce special interests in lobby groups. We should all be able to ask our legislators to do things, but it's how do you differentiate that between a special interest and a crony capitalist or a welfare state where you're begging for money rather than trying to beg for biblical policies?
Well, I think crony capitalism has to do more with like what we saw with the banks out in California, where there was a bailout of them because of who they are and the relationships that they had with Congress. And then also when you have, say, like a tariff might be, and I know Henry talks more about this later in the book, but tariffs, when you're picking and choosing winners and losers, when you have the civil authorities making more narrow laws as opposed to like broad biblical or broader principles that apply generally to everybody, that's when you get more towards crony capitalism and socialism, because now the civil authorities are picking winners and losers, and that's bad. So I think any author we've come across so far recognizes the danger between the civil authorities picking winners and losers and then constantly bailing out Wall Street. Those are the kinds of crony capitalist special interests that I have a problem with, instead of, or like lowering taxes for a specific sector. That would be a good example of bad policy. But if you're just lowering the corporate tax rate generally for everybody, that would be an example of a good policy that applies to everybody.
Yeah. It's very difficult. So can we, Nicole, do you have anything you want to add?
I guess just kind of the main thing I was taking away from it is a lot of times how with economics and how he's comparing it to man in your personal life, like it's like a child. Children can only see the immediate consequences of, I'm going to have this ice cream, it's going to taste good, but I can't see the long term that if I have, ice cream, candy, sugar, and sweets every day, that the long-term consequences is going to be cavities or whatever. So it's like, if something seems so simple and so basic that we can apply it to our personal life, then it would stand to reason that you would apply this to, bigger things.
Yeah.
That kind of.
So I would say that altruism gets in the way. That people are like, but I want that, like as a grandma, but I want them to have ice cream. Right? So the legislators are like, but I want to help the crippled autistic kids go to school.
It's very hard to say no. It's hard to say no. It's very easy to spend other people's money. And if we had to like actually, I don't remember who it was, but I read someone a while ago that talked about how it might have been, I was reading about Ronald Reagan, but at that time when he was growing up, you needed something, you went to your neighbor and you had to look them in the eye and you had to talk to them and ask them, and you knew whether you were alcoholic or whether you were lazy. They knew that. And so obviously everyone knows we've gone in the other direction where it's just easy for the legislator to spend someone else's money.
Yeah.
So
let's address Julie's question. I think it's a really good one. I think we'd all come to the same answer, but it's one we should be able to explain well. So Julie, tell us what you were thinking of.
Oh, let me pull it up. I forgot already.
Free.
So sometimes, just because we came off of the book of talking about slavery, so it was fresh on my mind. When you're passing a policy, does sometimes a policy appear to be for one group, like freeing slaves, that was for a particular group, benefit all the groups in the long run? Is this true for every situation? So if we were to, just culturally, we're in, equal rights for LGBTQ or those kinds of things. I would say that for slavery, biblically, there was slavery in the Bible, and whether slave or free, we're still held to a standard. So, but the question, can something appear to be for a group and actually benefit everyone? And if so, does that apply to other situations?
Yeah, I would say that we'd be mixing up the abuse of natural rights, right? Your natural right, God-given right, is to be free. And all of us think that that's what the rule of law should do, is protect the right to life, liberty, and property. And so it might be when we realize we're oppressing a certain group and then we stop oppressing it, we just have all more life, liberty, and property. That's how I would position it.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the same as saying, because, poor slave, now we have to give you reparations.
Right.
mm-hmm.
The consequences are different.
And in that, that's a great question, Julie. I'm going to think more about that one, but off the top of my head, with that particular example, you're basically just getting them back to where they should have been
in the first place
on natural footing. Yeah. And so I don't know that this addresses the question directly, but I've got to think too that any time we're creating biblical policy, and I know there are going to be some tough examples on things we might agree or disagree on that are biblical policies, but anytime we're doing that, I got to think it's always benefiting everybody, because you can't ever fix something with sin. It's impossible.
But aren't there things too that benefit all of us, and it's the way they go about it is what's wrong? So for instance, I don't like my neighbor polluting the water table or polluting the air, because it's something that as a free market person, I know they can't keep contained in their own little jurisdiction. It is going to creep into mine. So to have clean air policies and clean water policy and noise policy seems appropriate for government to say something about. But what they tend to do is not say something about it and have justice. They tend to actually try to fix it. And that's where they fail, is in the fixing of it.
Yeah.
You can think about that one too.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a role. That's why there's a role for civil government, right? There's now and then a reason. But where? do you draw that line? And what's their
In
responsibility?
Mhm.
in that particular example, I would ask, isn't that is that something that needs to be a policy, or is it that we need to start raising and teaching others that there are bad things that you can put in the air? There are, when you put particular detergents into a water system, that it's harmful. Is it something that actually needs to be a national policy or even a worldwide policy? Because to me, it seems like that comes down to just basic education.
So I guess what I was referring to is, like, I have an uncle who's really angry with his neighbor because he's doing two of those things. And he
Mhm.
never goes over and says to him, hey, can I help you clean this up? Right? That should always be our first response, not the government for anything like that. But if over time the neighbor just is not cooperating, then harm is being done to your neighbor. And that's an attack on life, liberty, and property. And that's what we have court systems for. That's what we have insurance for. But
Right.
I'm not saying it's an easy line to draw, Michelle.
Mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
And then policy, Julie, is law part of what you're talking about? Legislation, policy?
Sure. I mean, yeah.
Okay. Because the one thing that I was thinking of, I mean, if we're talking economics and taxes, I think it can, when Trump lowered the tax rate, the corporate tax rate, yes, that was for one specific group, but those
Oh,
group,
yeah.
that particular group, that has an effect on everybody because of it. I'm losing my words right now, because of the fact that those are our employers. They employ a lot of people, and if they don't have to pay the higher taxes, it's going to make a difference in how they operate their business.
Mhm.
I think the problem comes in, Michelle, is when whether it's a president or state government, does it in such a way that it only helps certain businesses and not every business.
Yes, there's
Right.
that too. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then I think that's where you get tangled up with this lobbying bureaucracy tangle, that, or this web that we have weaved, where that can necessarily have an effect on how the policy is written, or how the legislation is written by those that have the influence on those writing the laws and the policies.
Yeah. It's really hard. It's really hard to govern sinful people. There's some quote that's, I'm going to mess it up, but there's a quote that says, good men don't want to govern other men, but we need those good men to be in the government. Right? So it's such
Yeah.
a catch-22.
Mhm.
That's what we're dealing with now. We have an absence of good men who want to govern, so that they can say no more law, no more spending,
Mhm.
lower taxes. So
Mhm. What's interesting, I was on an interview, to me it was interesting, I was on an interview last night, and I was a little nervous about getting on because it was going to be about the New York City teachers unions saying that they didn't want any more money for the special needs programs with the Jewish schools that are funded by the government. And they are mad that also the government isn't paying the special needs kids at the public schools funding as quickly as they said they were going to. So this guy wanted me to come on and talk about that. And all I could think about is, okay, how am I going to beat up little kids that are autistic and Jewish and special needs in such a way that it glorifies God? So it turned out, it worked out. It was fine. But it's like, the headlines are always going to be we're going to help this group, or we're going to be mad that this group is doing what they're doing. Is very little thought to any of it. So,
Well, and
Well,
you
the
know what? It takes
manipulation of a
longer.
headline.
Mhm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, in my experience, it takes much longer too. I think Henry actually talks about this here in the beginning, where it just seems to take much longer to make the right argument. You know, today someone asked me about, you know, if we were to get rid of civil government schools, wouldn't there just be so many people that would be, you know, crime would go up, and they acted like suddenly there'd just be mayhem in the streets. You know, and I had to go through it and talk about, okay, this is a slow change. It's cultural. You know, we're not giving our kids the education they need right now anyway. They're always going to be sinners that don't educate their children. You know, I had to go through all of this. And it takes so much longer to explain the proper things to people.
it's kind of like how the first question non-homeschoolers ask us is about socialization. And, you know, so the first question they ask to you is like, but what are you going to do with the kids if they're not in school? There's no thought to an alternative way of looking at things. And this is what Hazlitt's challenging us, I think, to do.
Mhm.
Well, let me ask initially, does anyone so far in what we've discussed disagree with anything that, and I know I talked, you know, a little about the distinction here in lobbying, but does anyone have anything that they disagree with Hazlitt on so far?
I disagree with him eventually, but not through this part.
Okay.
Well, I do kind of disagree
sure.
with this distinction. Seems obvious about like Don Juan and the drug people and stuff. I typed that in the chat room. I'm not sure people really think that there's consequences. I think a lot of people think they're above the consequences.
Okay. Well, so far, I know I talked about lobbying here and provided an alternative view, but so far I haven't come across anything in his writing that I disagree with. And whomever said that he is one of the few economists that can write well is correct. He can write very well, and he's very easy to read.
Good. So something I would challenge you guys to read. It's short. We used to read it in challenge 1, and then because of copyright issues, we had to change things, and we're bringing it back. But it's Davy Crockett's "It's Not Yours to Give." Have any of you read that? It's short,
And
and it's a true story, and it highlights in a story that a 12-year-old can understand what Hazlitt's trying to say. So I recommend you look at that. Okay, so do you want to ask your question, Michelle, even though it's ahead of where we got to tonight?
yeah, let me see if I can find it. I'm learning how to quote unquote mark a book. So it was on, let's see, it's in chapter 4, public works mean taxes. And if you have the book, let me turn my camera on here a second. If you have this book here, this one with the cover that looks like that, it's towards the bottom of page 33. So it's in that very first section of chapter 4, where he said, all that has happened, let's see, he was talking about the bridge project and the government employing
Right here.
people. So they are, all that has happened at best is that there has been a diversion of jobs.
You passed it, Julie. Sorry, I'm trying to get her to stop. Go ahead.
Okay.
No? Go ahead, Meg.
Okay, so it's all that has happened is the paragraph starts with therefore, just as a marker. All that has happened at best is that there has been a diversion of jobs because of the project. More bridge builders, fewer automobile workers, television technicians, clothing workers, farmers. And
Right.
I'm thinking, well, is he trying to say that the automobile workers, the television technicians are then going to leave to be the bridge builders? Or is he going back to that, the glass, the broken bakery window, where there are people that may not get money because of the fact that now the baker has to pay for a new window instead of the tailor and the seamstress and all of those? I just don't get, I'm not getting the reasoning. I don't even know what the word is.
Just above that, on the same page, in the paragraph above that, he says, if the bridge costs 10 million, the taxpayers will lose 10 million. And so I think that's the rationale he's relying on, is that that money came from the taxpayers. And because it came from the taxpayers, that $10 million cannot be utilized by them so that they can hire more automobile workers, television techs, clothing workers, and farmers.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
So that's the way I'm seeing it. I actually bracketed that part about, because it's a zero sum. I mean, nowadays there's more spending than taxing, but I think he's saying because there's a zero sum in the amount of money in the economy, the 10 million was basically taken from the taxpayers, the private sector. And then I think elsewhere he argues that even if that $10 million is spent, it's spent more inefficiently than the private sector would spend it.
So let's next week, because we're out of time, talk about what you mean by zero sum, and let's talk about the effects of this on with fiat money, because right now there's a short-term fix to this that the government uses, and talk about the various ways money is looked at, and go right back to this paragraph because it's in the next section, because we're out of time for tonight. Good question.
All right, everybody, that was good, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Bye.
Okay, goodbye now.